Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of History's Greatest Battles. As always, if you know somebody that enjoys this flavor of history, please share the podcast with them. It's hard to play what-if games with any degree of accuracy, but today's conflict, the naval battle of Tsushima, sowed the seeds of an imperial nation that would create a dominant naval force and a culturally induced, fanatical military. According to an Irish military historian, a master's graduate in military history and strategic studies who goes by the moniker Never Felt Better, his blog will be linked in the show notes. He had this to say about today's battle. Japan could finally be recognized as a great power after Tsushima. The battle's result contributed to its growing territorial ambitions as Korea, then Manchuria, were invaded. With a growing sense of superiority, Japan aimed to become the leader of East Asia. Viewing itself as an elite naval power, it acted as an equal to all other Pacific powers, the British Empire and the United States. Tsushima paved the way for Pearl Harbor, the innate sense within the Japanese Empire that it could win. A reverse of Tsushima, where the Japanese lost all their battleships and most of their fleet, would have devastated the Japanese war effort. With supremacy in the environment, Russia would have had clear motivation to send more troops into the area, and there is every possibility that they would have had success against now isolated Japanese forces who had already suffered severe losses. With victory in the war, Russia would have gained control over Korea, greater influence over China, and would have had to be recognized as the eminent power of the Pacific. Its internal unrest would also have lacked staying power with such a military victory, and its subsequent fortunes in World War I would have been different. Japan, on the other hand, would have been dealt a severe blow, its ambitions dented, and more importantly, its pride. It would have been unable to expand as aggressively as it did during the following decades, and almost certainly would not have been powerful enough to challenge the United States in 1941. Let's now experience the naval battle of Tsushima.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 78, The Battle of Tsushima, the 27th of May, 1905. Russian forces, 8 battleships, 8 cruisers, 9 destroyers. Japanese forces, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 21 destroyers, and 60 torpedo boats. The catastrophic defeat of the Russian fleet at Tsushima shattered Russia's aspirations as a naval power, sealing its decline on the seas. At the same time, the victory cemented Japan's emergence as a dominant force in naval warfare, signaling a seismic shift in global power dynamics.
In the years 1894 and 1895, Japan thundered onto the world stage with a victory so decisive it left the great powers of the era stunned. The war against China fought for dominance over Korea and the vital Liaotung Peninsula, which thrusts boldly into the Sea of Japan, showcased a rising empire's power. Yet no sooner had Japan tasted triumph than the European powers, their ambitions cloaked in diplomacy, intervened. Under relentless pressure, Japan was forced to relinquish nearly all its conquests, including the invaluable prize of Port Arthur, a fortress commanding the tip of the Liaotung Peninsula. Seizing the moment, Russia moved swiftly. With ruthless precision, it coerced the Chinese government into granting the right to extend the Trans-Siberian Railway deep into Manchuria, all the way to Port Arthur. To solidify its grip, Russia claimed Port Arthur as a bastion for its Pacific Squadron, the pride of its navy, while stationing the remainder of its fleet in the icy northern waters of Vladivostok. For Japan, the humiliation ran deep. The empire's leaders seethed, and its people nursed a fiery resentment toward Russia, which they saw as the primary instigator of this indignity. In 1899, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay brokered a fragile consensus among the world's great powers. Britain, Germany, France, Russia, and Japan agreed to the so-called open door policy, a doctrine proclaiming free trade with China's vast and resource-rich markets. Japan saw this policy as a gateway to Manchuria, a land brimming with the raw materials that its resource-starved industries desperately needed to fuel their ambitions. Since opening its doors to the outside world in 1854, Japan had embarked on an unrelenting mission to bridge the technological chasm separating it from the industrial titans of the West. For Japan, a nation woefully devoid of natural resources, the coal and iron ore buried beneath Manchuria's soil gleamed like treasure waiting to be claimed. But Russia, with its imperial swagger, had no intention of honoring the open-door policy it had so begrudgingly endorsed. Japan pursued negotiations seeking fair access to Manchuria's markets. Russia, however, feigned diplomacy while reinforcing its military presence, signaling its contempt for compromise. By the dawn of 1904, Japan's patience was exhausted. Its leaders resolved to act decisively and with force. Under the cover of darkness on the 8th of February, just before the stroke of midnight, Japanese destroyers and torpedo boats slipped silently into Port Arthur. Their target? The anchored Russian fleet, vulnerable and unaware. When the attack commenced, chaos erupted. 3 Russian vessels were battered, left listing in the harbor under the ferocity of Japan's opening strike. As dawn broke, Admiral Heihachiro Togo led the full strength of Japan's navy into action, raining down a relentless bombardment on Russian ships and the shore defenses that guarded them. The Russian fleet suffered further devastation, but when their return fire struck several Japanese vessels, Togo calculated the risks and pulled his forces back. Despite outnumbering their foes, the Russian fleet remained stagnant, failing to seize the opportunity to counterattack and break the Japanese assault. Meanwhile, the Japanese refrained from pressing the advantage, leaving the battered Russian fleet anchored but intact, a missed opportunity that would later weigh heavily on the strategists. What Admiral Togo could not yet grasp was the true state of his enemy. The Russian fleet, plagued by shoddy training and low morale, was defended by gunners whose aim was as feeble as their spirit. Unaware of this weakness, Togo chose caution, unwilling to gamble his smaller, more vital fleet on what might have been an overwhelming triumph. The very next day, on the 9th of February, Japanese ships struck again. This time in the harbor of Chemulpo, 2 Russian vessels were left crippled under a hail of Japanese fire, their crews scuttling them in a desperate bid to avoid capture. Japanese forces swiftly followed up with a ground invasion, capturing Chemulpo and setting the stage for a full-scale offensive into Manchuria by early May. Meanwhile, at Port Arthur, the Russian fleet gained a new commander, Admiral Stepan Makarov, a man known for his discipline and his tactical rigor. Makarov wasted no time whipping his demoralized crew into shape. On the 13th of April, he led them out of the safety of the harbor, determined to take the fight to the very enemy. But fate intervened cruelly. Makarov's flagship struck a Russian-laid mine, sinking to the depths and taking the admiral and the admiral's ambitions with it. His successor, paralyzed by indecision, opted for inaction. The fleet remained tethered in Port Arthur, a powerful force rendered useless by a commander who feared mistakes more than defeat. The Japanese army seized the moment. Their artillery pounded Port Arthur into submission, obliterating its harbor and sinking the remnants of the Russian fleet, now trapped and defenseless. Outraged by the annihilation of his Pacific squadron, Tsar Nicholas II issued orders for the Baltic fleet to embark on a perilous journey to the east, an odyssey born of desperation and imperial pride. Command filled Admiral Zinovy Rozhdestvensky, a man whose uninspired leadership matched the aging fleet under his charge. 4 modern battleships aside, the journey was a marathon of missteps and calamities. In the North Sea, fear of phantom Japanese torpedo boats drove the Russian fleet to disaster. They opened fire on British fishing vessels near the Dogger Banks, sinking several and igniting a diplomatic crisis that nearly spiraled into all-out war. Seeking to avoid further blunders, Rozhdestvensky split his forces. Half the fleet braved the turbulent waters of the Cape of Good Hope, while the other half threaded through the Suez Canal, both converging in Madagascar for resupply. By the time the battered fleet reached Madagascar on the 1st of January 1905, news arrived that Port Arthur had fallen. Japan's victory was complete, and Russia's humiliation deepened. After regrouping and resupplying in French Indochina, the combined fleet set sail on the 14th of May for the final, grueling leg toward Vladivostok, their spirits worn thin by the arduous journey. Rozhestvensky knew full well that the Japanese Navy would await him if he chose the route west of Japan, yet he pressed onward, resigned to a confrontation he was ill-prepared to win. Togo, meanwhile, had learned from every prior engagement. His crews were drilled to perfection, and his battleships were armed with newly refined shells to replace the earlier munitions that had failed in combat. Togo commanded a formidable force: 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 21 destroyers, and 60 torpedo boats. Though the Russians outgunned him in capital ships, his vessels were faster, more advanced, and manned by superior crews. The Japanese crews operated with unmatched discipline and confidence, their training honed to perfection, a stark contrast to the weary and the ill-prepared Russian sailors. Togo also hungered for battle, eager to strike a decisive blow. Rozhestvensky, by contrast, sought only to survive, his sole aim to reach Vladivostok and merge with what was left of the Russian Pacific Fleet. Togo held every advantage. He operated near his own shores, navigating the waters he knew intimately, while his Russian adversary sailed blind in hostile seas. Togo anchored his fleet at Masampo Bay off southern Korea, waiting for word of the Russian fleet's approach. His strategy was already in place, ready to unleash the moment his prey was sighted. With the revolutionary power of wireless telegraphy at his disposal, Togo planned to move the instant the Russian fleet revealed itself, striking with speed and with precision. His strategy was bold and calculated. He would position his battleships to cut directly across the Russian line, unleashing devastating broadsides, while his cruisers swung around to attack from the rear. Once the larger vessels had sown chaos, his torpedo boats would dart in like wolves, tearing through the crippled Russian fleet and finishing off their prey. At dawn on the 27th of May, 1905, the Japanese vessel Siano Maru spotted the Russian fleet through the thickening morning fog. The enemy's position was confirmed when it nearly collided with a Russian hospital ship trailing the column. Rozhestvensky charted his course through the perilous straits separating Japan's main island of Honshu and the rocky isle of Tsushima, a route that would soon become his undoing. Sailing in 2 unwieldy columns, the Russian fleet scrambled to form a single line after encountering the Japanese, their disorganized maneuvers revealing their vulnerability. By 10 a.m., Russian lookouts sighted the Japanese fleet advancing from the northwest. Japanese cruisers shadowed them, maintaining a steady course just 6 miles to the west. At noon, Rozhestvensky ordered a course adjustment, steering east by north. Oblivious to the approaching storm, Russian officers in their wardroom raised glasses to toast the anniversary of Tsar Nicholas's coronation. Shortly before 2 p.m., aboard his flagship Mikasa, Togo executed a masterstroke. He brought his battleships into position to cross the head of the Russian line, a maneuver that would rain fire upon the enemy while exposing only his own broadsides. The maneuver was flawless. The Japanese ships unleashed devastating broadsides while the Russian fleet, plodding forward, could respond only with their forward guns, powerless to match Togo's onslaught. Desperate to retaliate, Rozhestvensky turned his fleet to run parallel with the Japanese line, but Togo's superior speed and precise gunnery ensured he remained master of the engagement. The Russian flagship Suvorov bore the brunt of the Japanese assault, taking heavy fire early on. By 3 p.m., its steering was destroyed, leaving the vessel a crippled hulk amidst the chaos. With their flagship disabled, the spirit of the Russian fleet disintegrated, their resistance faltering in the face of relentless Japanese fire. Bloodied and barely conscious from 2 wounds, Rozhestvensky relinquished command late in the day. With grim resignation, he ordered his second-in-command, Rear Admiral Nikolai Navigatov, aboard the Nikolai I, to save what ships he could and push through the straits toward Vladivostok. But salvation was not to come. By the end of the 27th of May, 3 more Russian battleships had been sent to the depths. Through the pitch-black night, Japanese torpedo boats prowled like predators, striking without mercy and sowing chaos among the battered remnants of the Russian fleet. By dawn, the battle's grim conclusion was clear. Every Russian vessel that had failed to escape was either sunk or captured, leaving no hope for redemption. Of the once proud fleet, only a lone cruiser and 2 destroyers limped north to Vladivostok. 3 destroyers turned tail and sought refuge in the Philippines, where they were promptly interned in Manila, a final humiliation. At the cost of just 3 torpedo boats and 1,000 men, along with minor damage to their capital ships, the Japanese achieved one of history's most staggering naval triumphs, a victory that would echo through the halls of maritime warfare. Not since the era of Trafalgar had the world witnessed such a lopsided contest between 2 ostensibly balanced fleets, a stark testament to Japan's preparedness and Russia's folly. Even the U.S. triumph at Manila Bay paled in comparison, for that victory had been a foregone conclusion between vastly unequal forces. At Tsushima, the stakes and opponents were far closer in scale, on paper at least. At Tsushima, the devastation was total. The Japanese obliterated 6 Russian battleships and seized 2 as trophies of war. 4 Russian cruisers met their doom, while 4 others managed to flee under the cover of darkness, their survival owed to sheer luck. The slaughter extended to Russia's destroyers, 7 annihilated, 2 captured, and the human toll was staggering, with nearly 10,000 Russian sailors killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The disaster at Tsushima, following so closely after the shattering defeat at Mukden, sent tremors through Moscow's corridors of power. The Tsar's government teetered under the weight of failure and fury. The defeats fanned the flames of revolution, culminating in the upheaval of 1905. Recognizing the precariousness of their position, Russian leaders yielded to U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt's offer to mediate peace talks in August of 1905. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, envoys from Japan and Russia met to hammer out terms of peace, a treaty born from blood and exhaustion. Among the treaty's most hotly debated issues was the fate of the surviving Russian vessels, symbols of pride for some and trophies of war for others. The Nikolai I and the Orel, captured and repaired by the Japanese, had already been absorbed into their navy, serving as stark reminders of Russia's humiliation. Japan sought to keep these prizes as spoils of war, but Russia, clinging to its pride, demanded their return, likely envisioning them as the foundation of a rebuilt navy. It was only under the firm insistence of Roosevelt that the Japanese reluctantly agreed to return the captured ships, a concession that left an extremely bitter taste. This compromise, though seemingly minor, sent ripples through U.S.-Japanese relations, hinting at tensions to come. The Japanese government acquiesced to the Treaty of Portsmouth, but the public was far less forgiving, viewing the terms as a betrayal of their nation's hard-won victories. To many Japanese, the surrender of their rightful spoils echoed the humiliation of 1895, when European powers had stripped them of their conquests after defeating China. The failure to secure reparations from Russia only deepened their resentment, much of it now directed at the United States. Tensions boiled over just months later when California legislators enacted discriminatory laws targeting Japanese immigrants. The insult was not lost on Japan, and anger surged on both sides of the Pacific. Japan's press erupted with fiery editorials demanding action against what they saw as a blatant affront to their nation's honor. Sensing the dangerous currents of public opinion in Japan and their potential to influence policy, President Theodore Roosevelt took a bold step. He ordered the U.S. battleship fleet to undertake an unprecedented voyage around the globe, a demonstration of American power cloaked in the guise of diplomacy. Dressed in striking white, a color chosen to symbolize peace, the Great White Fleet steamed into Tokyo Bay in the summer of 1907. Its arrival was a spectacle designed to both impress and to reassure. The Japanese greeted the fleet with extraordinary hospitality, masking any lingering resentment. Yet beneath the surface, the U.S. fleet itself teetered on the edge of calamity. Mechanical breakdowns plagued the fleet during its journey, exposing the aging American ship's vulnerabilities when measured against Japan's sleek and modern naval power. Lacking escort ships and dependent on foreign colliers for refueling, the fleet sailed at considerable risk. Had Japan chosen conflict, the U.S. ships might have shared the fate of the Russian fleet at Tsushima. Yet no clash occurred. Instead, the two navies forged a rare camaraderie, culminating in the Root-Takahira Agreement, which delicately defined the boundaries of U.S. and Japanese influence in the Pacific. Roosevelt left no room for doubt. Japan had emerged as a first-rate naval power, a force that demanded both respect and careful attention. The agreement, while limiting U.S. fortifications in the Pacific, preserved a fragile peace between the two nations, a peace that would endure remarkably for nearly 3 decades. Roosevelt would not live to witness the full realization of his foresight. By the late 1930s, Japan's naval might had surpassed even his expectations, unleashed after the collapse of the shipbuilding limitation treaties of the 1920s. Decades of simmering resentment over Japan's treatment as a second-class power by the West reached a breaking point in 1941. The war Roosevelt had long feared finally erupted, consuming the Pacific in flames. In the end, it was the reimagined U.S. Navy of World War II, vastly modernized, expanded, and battle-hardened, that finally settled the question of naval supremacy in the Pacific.